Really great to be here. I bring greetings from my fellow New Schoolers in New York who've been here before me, Leslie Painter-Farrell and Scott Thornbury, and Jeremy Harmer. So, teacher educators at the Crossroads, the role of theory and practice. What I would like to do in this 45 minutes now, right, Stafford? Yeah? Is very quickly touch upon a few things that make the field of teacher education as I see it. I believe with Kessel and Korthagen that teacher education, all the fields of human knowledge that education is concerned with, is the only field that has yet to develop a viable pedagogy. We don't yet own a pedagogy for educating teachers. And teacher education is not something that is only done in a classroom, in an institutional setting. Actually, it's quite a new domain of education. If we think of the birth of the teacher educator as happening concurrently with the birth of the first TESOL programs that were not linguistics programs, those coincide with the foundation of the two main professional organizations, IATEFL and TESOL, in the 1960s. So we're talking 1966. We're still pretty young, not even half a century old as a profession. And a lot has happened in those years. And when we think of what is a teacher educator, what would you consider a teacher educator to be? How would you define us? Okay, no definitions? Could you speak up, please? Oh, okay, sorry. Can anybody relay? In the practice, a teacher educator. Okay. I like to use a terminology that I'm borrowing from Angie Malderis and Martin Waddell, which is the term teacher of teachers, to do away with the dichotomy between teacher trainer and teacher educator that seems to permeate the field. If you're a teacher trainer, you're looked down upon. If you're a teacher educator, that has a little bit more repute. And what I would like to contend today is that for a long time we've been entrenched in the argument between training and educating, and we have failed to find a perspective that could bring together the best traditions in what we do. I define a teacher of teachers as anybody who has a stake in the professional learning of a colleague, right? So a teacher of teachers could be a teacher trainer in the proper sense of the word. People who work in short, intensive courses, basically at the initial level. Teacher educator, generally this has the connotation of somebody working at a university and mostly in postgraduate work. A professional development specialist. In our field we have a lot of those people who come, do research in an institution and then propose ways to advance teachers' professional learning. Some institutions have directors of studies who organize the curriculum and its delivery, as well as the assessment and evaluation of the students, and in doing so, they work directly with teachers. In other institutions, we have level coordinators. I don't know if this is popular in Korea. In our university, at least, in our ESL program, we do have level coordinators. We have 4 levels of ESL in our ESL program, and, excuse me, I'm gonna close the door because I get distracted. And that person is also curriculum manager and professional development specialist. We have mentors or cooperating teachers who open their classrooms to aspiring teachers so that they can do the teaching practice in. And even moves, colleagues. Actually, research indicates that the most fruitful professional development conversations happen where? In the staff room, in the staff room. So in fact, once we are a teacher working in an institutional setting, we are all teachers of teachers. and student teachers. Which brings me to the point that in general, when one considers the teacher of teachers, the person who bestows the knowledge upon the aspiring one, there's a pocket of research, mostly stemming from Latin America, that seems to indicate that in the cooperating teacher, student-teacher relationship, the person who is winning the most is the cooperating teacher, getting a lot of information and input on the advancements of the field from the student teachers and not directly from their own involvement in teacher education. So if we can use a metaphor, let's use Yoda and Luke. The teacher educator is Yoda. Luke is the hero, right? The teacher with whom we interact and the teacher we hope to bring into the fold of the profession. Now, how do we become teachers of teachers? Can I ask this question? How many teachers of teachers are there here in the room? Okay, how did you come to the profession? What kind of professional preparation did you get? On your feet, exactly. Now, this was me on my first day in a teacher education institution in a formal role. Basically, we become teacher educators. Ours is a very complex field with different institutional settings, with different aims and objectives for teaching and learning English. And in many cases, one becomes a teacher educator because he or she is a good language teacher, right? So these are some of the reasons my colleagues voiced as reasons to become teacher educators. Promotion, willingness to be professionally engaged, institutional needs, postgraduate school, they did a master's and a doctorate, and the consequence was they were teacher educators. There was a change in institutional roles, people who went from being directors of studies to being teacher trainers, some people out of vocation, and I like that one because there was no one else, right? So I had to step up and do it, right? So it's a matter of perspective. If we come to teacher education or teaching teachers because we're good teachers, we should analyze the activity of teaching teachers and compare it to the activity of teaching learners. So if we look at what teaching learners entails from an activity theory perspective, right? Activity theory is a way of analyzing practices, and it takes into account a systemic perspective on the activity, and that means that when one of the elements in the activity changes, the whole activity itself changes as well. This is the activity, and a quick analysis of teaching foreign languages or second languages. We have a subject who's the second language teacher. We have the object who are second language learners, and the result is fluent users of a second language. Fluent and accurate, I should say. Look at the rules we work within. Every activity has certain rules. In the case of teaching languages, we have norms and regulations of the institution, of the educational systems, the institutional culture, learning theories, syllabi, etc. The communities we interact with and we are part of. Other teachers, parents, administrators. How labor is divided. Who does what in the activity? Well, basically, a teacher has to do with the labor. I'm trying to rush, I'm sorry. The work of the teacher is mainly concerned with planning, teaching, managing students and curriculum, assessing of and for learning, and of course the instruments we use are the knowledge of the second language, culture, pedagogy, and resources. And we may be very good at that. And who we serve is our students. However, when we change from language teacher to teacher of teachers, look at how the activity changes. The subject and the object are totally different, and the result is also different. So basically what we are is something like this. A teacher of teachers is concerned mostly with supporting the professional learning and also helping or easing the new professional into the very difficult and emotionally charged moving sands of becoming a language teacher. These two different activities cannot be equated, and one of the things that I would like to see in our field is a code of practice for teaching teachers. Something that mandates that whoever is in charge of the professional education of a colleague has suitable preparation for the task. In my case, I was a very young person with just 5 years teaching experience under my wings when I was just thrust, because there was no one else, into teaching my colleagues, right? I didn't have a clue about how to go about it. So how did I go about it? By doing what my teacher educators did to me. I'm basically focusing on what had helped me learn best. So I was in fact reproducing my apprenticeship of observation, as Lordy would say. Did I succeed? Well, my foremost memory of my first year was the end of year party. In the end of year party, my students put together little skits to imitate their professors, right? And I remember distinctly watching them move furniture like crazy around the room, jumping from one place to the other, handing out copious piles of handouts, and always saying, whenever anybody asked me a question, let me get back to you on that. So, how do we get there? We get there with baggage. We get there with the baggage that comes not just from our apprenticeship of observation, but also through our experience. If you, like me, are lucky enough to be a second language learner teaching English, we come with the baggage of our own language learning experience, the models of language learning that affected our learning. Also, if you have gone through a formal teacher education or training process, you come there with theory that you are supposed to replicate in the classroom. But we also come with histories that we collect in the staff room, that we collect in interaction with other colleagues, who tell us their successes, particularly because when we don't find a way out, we generally ask, and we are a pretty generous profession. We get entrenched in ways of doing, right? We know that when we start teaching, it's a very high stakes thing. We are always facing that wall from our dreams and aspirations that I'm going to change the world through my teaching, and all of a sudden I get all these teenagers who are screaming at me and playing tricks. I cannot manage them. I turn around to write something on the board, and then you consider I have to quit, right? That is our first stage. Then, with a little bit of time, we ease into doing things. We plan our lessons. We keep on top of things. We try to keep on top of things. And then progressively, either we move forward in the profession, we diversify, and eventually we retire. But along that time, we're collecting ways of doing things, and we tend to get fixed on those things. As Kumara Vadivelu says when he criticizes the notion of method, one of the things he says is teachers who claim not to follow a method, in fact, follow their own method, the one they created, right? And we all do that. And also with funds of knowledge, which are collective constructions that are part of the profession. We also come in default, because there are trends in our profession. There are the ways, I call them the spring or summer collections, right? Every few years we get all this influx of new ideas that are the truth revealed, and we are supposed to change everything we do and do those things in a particular way. These are the default settings. But we also come with ghosts behind the blackboard, right? Which are those voices that keep telling us, don't do that when you're about to do it, when you're trying to reflect on action, right? If we were to look at the history of teacher education, as I said, it was very brief. English language, TESOL teacher education, but teacher education in general started in our profession with being a native speaker. That was the only requirement, right? Absolutely, not just Renaissance. I'm talking about, I come from Latin America originally, and it was no strange coincidence that right before the Second World War, we see the birth of the binational centers. And we have the Alliance Française for French, we have the British and the American Binational Institutes, we have the Goethe Institute and the Società Dante Alighieri for Italian. Those are languages that are popular in Latin America. And what did they bring? Native speakers, who, by the way, were not teachers, they were spies. That's the truth. I mean, read history. And that part of the southern cone, right, particularly the southern cone of Latin America, was great for catching communications. So the first teacher, educator, teachers of English, French, Italian, whatever, were actually spies. But being a native speaker was the main condition. Then in the 1960s, and thanks to two wonderful people, John and Britta Haycraft, do they ring a bell? International House World Organization. They came up with a short, intensive teacher preparation course, and they advertised it. I actually saw a little ad, and I have been trying to find it to show it, but I haven't been able to. And it says, 3-week teacher preparation course with classroom practice, which meant that before that, there was no classroom practice. Though that short intensive course got refined and eventually became what is now the CELTA, the Certificate in English Language Teaching to Adults, and then it got expanded into the DELTA, right? The diploma courses. Then teacher preparation programs appear in the 60s, the late 60s at the university level, mostly geared towards graduate students, and the birth of the masters in TESOL and the professional doctorates or the research doctorates. So basically, how one becomes a teacher educator is a matter of luck of the draw, where you are in the world, when you were born, what the conditions around you were, right? I, as I said, come from Latin America. Until the year 2004, there was not a single master's in education in my country, let alone a doctorate. So the most you could aspire to have was a BA. You needed a master's, you had to go abroad. How many people could go abroad? I come from a country of 3 million people. And I can tell you how many in the TESOL field. 8. 8. All right, so it's a luck of the draw. Now, the history of how we get there is one thing, but what we need to possess in order to teach teachers is another thing. What are the domains of teacher knowledge? How do we become the person that we are in the classroom? Again, I'm going to quote Madeles and Waddell, and you will have the bibliography at the end. But they say basically there are 3 kinds of teacher knowledge. First of all, there's knowing about. It's this kind of declarative knowledge that we can convey with words, and it's knowledge about what you teach. Supposedly you should know that, though reality tells us, as Willie was telling us this morning, many times teachers don't know English, but they teach English anyway, right? I don't know if you're familiar, but assessments of EFL teachers' proficiency in Latin America are showing amazing results. In most countries, the median level of teachers in the Common European Framework is A2. A2, that is the second level in the Common European Framework. I'm talking about Colombia, I'm talking about Ecuador, I'm talking about Chile, Uruguay. And the syllabi they are supposed to teach aspire to get the students to graduate high school with a B1 level. My question is, how can a teacher who doesn't have the language teach? We are seeing weird experiments. In Uruguay now they're teaching English through video conference. And guess who they have hired to teach the video conferences? Yeah, Yes, native speakers, right? And they have gone to particular parts of the world where the native speaker comes cheap. That's the other thing, right? Yes. So knowing about is also knowing about your students, knowing about your institution, knowing your curriculum, and being able to articulate your curriculum. Of course, there's knowing how. And you cannot see this wonderful lady. She plays the saw in the subway station. I take the subway every day. And I look at her, and I'm mesmerized. If I took a chainsaw like her and a violin bow, I wouldn't be able to crack the beautiful music she makes, right? We teachers have to develop that kind of knowledge. We can be very theoretical, have all these theories, but if we cannot put them into practice in the classroom, our students don't learn. And eventually, what is teaching about? It's about the students. And if this were not enough, there is also a more intangible, personal kind of knowledge, which Malderes and Waddell call knowing to. This knowing to is very difficult to articulate into words. It's ironic, as Sarah Fletcher says, that when we do our teacher education, we try to pack up all this knowledge and use it automatically. And when you become a teacher educator, your task is to unpack all that knowledge. And this knowing too is that intuitive knowledge, that sixth sense that we develop that let us know when we're with our back to the blackboard that somebody's going to do something, and we turn around at that time, right? We have that intuition. How do you teach that? One of the only ways in which you can do that is by promoting reflective practice, which unfortunately is not promoted in many teacher education programs. So, looking at this, I find that there are 4 traditions in our field, right? 3 of which were born as a consequence of resistance to the previous one. Like everything in our field, going from one end of the pendulum to the other, right? And what I would like to do today, if I have time, is, yes, I do, is propose a 4th tradition, which may bring together the best of the other 3, and at long last, bring some sense into this task of teacher education. And perhaps it will open up the field to start asking questions towards this viable pedagogy I was talking about at the beginning. So 4 traditions. I don't want to go into technical terms, so I'm going to call them look and learn, read and learn, and think and learn. And the 4th one I'm going to call participate and learn. So let's start with the look and learn tradition. Basically, it's a medieval form of instruction, but not medieval in a negative sense, right? There are no whips or torture racks here. It's basically a kind of teaching of teachers where you learn through replicating a particular model, right? It's all about observing a master teacher. And let me give you the criteria. And trying to emulate the actions of the master teacher. What is the role of the teacher of teachers? They are basically to act as a model, right? Not a cognitive model, but a behavioral model, mostly, right? The role of the teacher learner is to be a truthful replicator of the model. And what are the goals of this particular perspective in teaching teachers? Basically to act like a teacher. You have a series of behaviors, a repertoire of techniques that you should replicate no matter where in the world you are. You use those techniques. Like for example, eliciting. Like for example, using timelines to explain time differences. Raising your hand so that students are quiet. What sources of knowledge are dwelt upon in this particular perspective? Well, basically, knowledge is conceived of as comprising a series of behaviors that stem from a particular view of language, language teaching, and language learning. And the idea is that there's finite knowledge there. If you learn that, I once was doing research and I asked one of the people who moderate these international examinations, what kind of knowledge is there here? And the person said, well, basically, what we want is the teacher to be able to teach a lesson. We don't want them to plan a course. We don't want them to develop curriculum. It's just be a teacher in the classroom and teach a lesson. So that implies that the knowledge can be transferred to different people, and it's always the same core knowledge. Now, if one looks at the bibliography for these courses, it's not unusual to find most of the bibliography being published in the 1980s, 1990s, with a few second, third, fourth, or fifth editions of the same books which are published in the 21st century, right? So we are looking at a particular model there. What are the expected results? That people act as teachers. So you give them a textbook, for example, and a syllabus, and they can go into the classroom and do a PPP lesson or a TBL lesson or a potpourri lesson. What is the orientation to teaching teachers? Well, basically, you are the gatekeeper of the method, right? And even though in those courses now, supposedly people are doing reflection and they are reading about post-method perspectives, the whole arrangement is that of there's one way of doing this. And if this were not enough, one of the requirements to be a trainer in most of these programs is to shadow a trainer, not in one course, but at least in two. The first time you observe how it is done, the second time you observe and co-teach. But the co-teaching gives you not much freedom because you have to plan and deliver according to the way that trainer. So it's cascade training and is replicating the same orientation. The sources of training are what we can call best practices, or what are called best practices. But they are very general. And we know that as we move from country to country, continent to continent, situations are radically different. And what works in a monolingual country, where people leave the classroom and they have to use the language, otherwise they don't eat, they cannot get housing, is not the same thing that happens in our classrooms. I used to teach teenagers who would go without eating for 3 weeks, living in the slums of Montevideo. And I couldn't talk to them about what are you going to do. When I told a very wealthy friend of mine about what I did for a living and how I did it, he said, oh, great. So now they can go to the harbor where the cruise ships dock, and they can ask for money in English. They can say, a coin, please. That's not the same situation I find when I have a very entitled 15-year-old who's celebrating his sweet 15 by taking an English course in London, right? And then what is the theory-practice balance? Well, a lot of practice, very little theory, just enough. Something that amazes me about these short-term programs is that people go without reading a single book. They just read chapters, or they get summaries of chapters of books that the trainer has created in the form of a handout, right? So it was no wonder that there was resistance to this form of training. And the second perspective, the one I call read and learn, became popular mostly through the work of universities when they started doing BA programs in TESOL, and then of course moving on to graduate school with MAs and PhDs. And if we take the same criteria to analyze the second perspective, the role of the teacher of teachers in this case is to be a qualified informant. You are in touch with research because you do research. And what you do is inform to your aspiring teachers what kind of research works best. The idea, again, is on transmission, right? You are the one who will inform them what other researchers have found effective and you will involve them in researching how that is getting applied. The role of the teacher-learner is to be a good reader and a researcher. They have to risk it and do it. So the goals are two. If the first one was to act like a teacher, this one is to research like a teacher, right? Now, when you say research like a teacher, does that sound like the real thing? Actually, I always quote Don Freeman here when he says that speaking about teacher-researcher is a history of two nouns separated by a hyphen, right? And he's so right about that. Actually, teacher research is not considered valid or reliable because it's very situational, very contextualized. And if you are to, I mean, in general, I'm overgeneralizing here, excuse me about that, but we don't see a lot of research published in journals that has been carried out by teachers in the classroom, addressing classroom problems, right? We hear about that research mostly in the softer journals, which are generally not bought by the libraries of the institutions where we teach, but to which we subscribe, right? So the sources of knowledge here change from this set of best practices to the catalog of best research results. Again, the view of knowledge is a limited one in my opinion, because it means that there's research that cannot be applied because it has been rendered irrelevant or outdated by further research. But we all know when we read research that there's no clear-cut one way of doing things, okay? And most research is contradictory. You look at research on teacher cognition and teacher thinking, and you can find 5 different authors with 5 different opinions, and they have all confirmed their opinions through research. And the data are valid, reliable, statistical means have been ascertained. So where does this take us? The expected result, the orientation to toting then, to teaching teachers, is basically to induct the young, as one colleague of mine put it, into the professional literature, and then see whether they can apply it or not. What are the sources of training? They are limited again. It's basically second-hand research. It's not research in many places in the world that the teacher educator has undertaken him or herself. So it's second-hand. And whatever classroom organizations or classroom setups are available to the student teachers. Now, my concern with this perspective is that by engaging the aspiring teachers in these loops of research, we are putting at risk the student's future, because we know that when you do research, it's not the same thing as when you take a principled approach to teaching. What is the theory-practice balance? Well, basically, everything goes towards theory here. Fortunately, and thanks to the work of 2 individuals, we have been able to find a midway in these last almost 50 years, right? And I think that comes with the perspective that I call think and learn. The work of Dewey in the 1930s, and further along the word of Donald Schoen and people like the guy who's going to be talking today at 5:30, Tom Farrell, on reflective teaching, has given us midway in between the theory or practice balance. And if we analyze using the same criteria, we're going to see that the role of the teachers is to become a mental coach, a model of mental procedures, but also somebody who spurs on questions, who poses questions or helps the aspiring teacher pose questions to himself or herself. The role of the teacher-learner is an active, reflective practitioner. They see what they do and how it affects students' learning. They derive their own practical and personal theories, but they also consult the public theories that form the common core knowledge of the profession. The expected result is for people to think like teachers. Supposedly, we are emulating our professional thinking. And the orientation to tutoring is a lot of disclosure of our own selves as teachers. Now, one problem we come across here is that most teacher educators have left the classroom. And we haven't taught real English learners for a long time. So in my ideal set of requirements for teacher educators, I would include you have to teach at least one language course a year so that you stay grounded on what the reality of the classroom is, right? The sources of training, well, we have both theory and a set of practices. And the theory-practice balance seems to have been struck. There's only one downside to this perspective. And it is that in favoring this reflective stance, we tend to keep the reflection to ourselves, or at least to be shared in a dyadic way, but it does not become public. And it's a way of generating a lot of grounded personal theories in that sense. So even though this is great, I think we need to become a little bit more public. Again, quoting Donald Freeman, teachers do not characterize themselves for writing about their activity. We write lesson plans, but we don't write about how we do it, why we do it, and the consequences of that very much. It could be because we are overworked. It could be because it's not in us. So we don't publicize our research. So I would like to propose that we take a fourth perspective that comes from applying a new way, not a new way of thinking about teaching teachers, but taking a more social-cultural approach to the way we do things. And here, in this participate and learn perspective, we're going to be changing dramatically, because the role of the teacher of teachers is no longer that of the one who knows, the expert. The teacher of teacher becomes a co-learner in the sense that he or she should be responsive to whatever is happening in the classrooms. And the role of the teacher learner is to become an active co-participant who is at the same time a teacher to the students, but a teacher to his or her peers. If we look at teacher education from this kind of perspective, we see teacher education as a way of bringing outsiders within our professional community of practice. We can take Leib and Wenger's metaphor of the peripheral legitimate participation. We start off on the outskirts of the activity, and progressively, through changes in the community, through two main important processes, which are negotiation of meaning and reification of meaning, we become full participants. And the beautiful thing is, pardon me, that once we become full participants, the whole community has shifted, and we will need to shift with that community. So what I'm trying to say here is, let's start thinking outside the box for once. Let's do away with the dichotomies, and let's try to find a way where we can put together all the richness of the field. Because isn't it true that as a teacher you need to know, you need to reflect, but you also need to be good at doing things? When Schulman categorized teachers' knowledge, let's see if you remember, he talked about content knowledge, he talked about general pedagogical knowledge, he talked about what other kinds of knowledge? Remember? No? Pedagogical content knowledge. And he said that what makes us teachers, and contextual knowledge, is that pedagogical content knowledge. Because if we only possess content knowledge, we are a content specialist. If we only possess general pedagogical knowledge, we are basically entertainers. We have the techniques, but we don't have the English, which is what happens to many teachers around the world, you can keep the students engaged in something, but not necessarily learn. If you are more concerned with contextual knowledge, then what you get is a community activist, somebody who can advocate for his or her learners, but who cannot do more than that. A teacher, a true teacher, has a specific kind of knowledge, which synthesizes the other three in a very particular way. And that he terms pedagogical content knowledge. It's being able to know how to teach a certain kind of content to these students in these particular conditions so that learning happens, right? And that requires a lot of contextualization. Then what is the role, what is the goal? Well, the goal of this perspective would be to have people become teachers. And becoming is a process, it's not a state. Becoming takes time. And it also implies that we are all unfinished, even the teacher educator, right? And if you go to the Pechacucha today, I'm going to try and articulate some of my, my road into teaching over these past years. The sources of knowledge, anything that has to do with teaching in the classroom. Here we have research, we have practice, but we also have lived experience, what goes on in the teaching practice classrooms. That is brought up, it is reified through whatever you want to call it, critical incidents, reflective logs, videos, and that is the source of analysis. And you are not generating knowledge that can be generalized and extrapolated to any situation. You are generating knowledge that is relevant to the students here and now. In terms of the expected results, you've built a community of practice. And the beautiful thing about communities of practice is that they come together because of a convening activity. The activity that convenes our community is the learning of our students, who in general, unless you have the chance to go into the classroom and observe your aspiring teachers, those foreign language students are invisible to the teacher educator, particularly to those of us working in the ivory towers of the universities. Because we teach the course two hours a week, and then we get a supervisor, right? Sorry. So basically what this perspective would do is bring together all the others. And I would like to leave you with one little quote from Hankins and Hamel on something that has nothing to do with this, but I think this fourth perspective is captured in this quotation. Accepting a new paradigm does not imply doing away with our past or discrediting whatever came before us. There is no starting point from which to advance towards the future with any sort of certainty. However, we can start from where we discover ourselves today and in the historical moment in which we learn who we are. So if you were to ask me, how do you see these things? Well, to me, they are like matryoshka dolls. In a participate and learn perspective, you have all the other perspectives inside. And the beautiful thing is, once you pull them apart, you have a community. So thank you very much, everybody.